Wow. Now this is an interesting development in young earth creationism. At ICR, we want to start with a clean slate. We regret and ask for forgiveness for our August 2020 issue of Acts and Facts, in which we are condemnatory in our criticism of several fellow creation scientists, misrepresented some of their positions, and called them some names. The author also apologized for his words in a letter to the editor's section of the Creation Research Science Quarterly. We are truly sorry for the hurt we inflicted and are grieved that others have subsequently picked up on the name calling in our article to aid in new denunciations. We will endeavor not to engage in those behaviors in the future. Why is Randy Guliuzza, president of the Institute for Creation Research, writing this paragraph this past weekend? Stick around and we'll find out. All right, here we are. We're at the Institute for Creation Research website. And on this particular site, Randy Guliuzza, on April 28th, 2023, published this article. It's an article promoting the ICC, the International Creation Conference, that's coming up on July 16th through 19th at Cedarville University, right here in Ohio. And it also is promoting a covenant for civility and respect. And you might wonder, why? What does he need to write that about? Well, it has a little bit to do with the International Creation Conference, more to do with what Answers in Genesis has been doing the last couple months, which is writing a whole series of articles about other young earth creationists, warning about the dangers of young earth creationists who have incorrect views within the young earth creationist myths, which Answers in Genesis calls young earth evolution or young earth evolutionist. And this article, although it does not specifically mention Answers in Genesis, is clearly sending a signal to Answers in Genesis about how they feel about that particular series of articles and what it's doing to the creation science community, which is something that I've said I've thought was going to be a big concern and a big mistake by Answers in Genesis. And Randy Guliuzza here has expressed many of my particular views and said it in a much better way than I have or have attempted to say so far about how I feel about these young earth evolution diatribes coming out of Answers in Genesis. And so I want to take a few moments to scan through this article with you that I've just looked at and pull out some of the things that he has to say about civility, all right, among fellow Christians, among young earth creationists, and how they ought to be interacting with one another. And this is talking about the International Creation Conference is an opportunity to do that because it only happens every 5 years. The last one was in Pittsburgh, and I remember I had wanted to go to that and I was unable to, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make it to Cedarville, even though it's not far from me, where I'm at right now. But every 5 years, that scarcity is good because it attracts the top creation science researchers from around the world, right? And that's one of the reasons why I'd want to go, is to see some of the top creation researchers and be able to hear some of the discussion, right? And this is where you really see, like, what is the current state of young earth creationism? Because what you have is you have the top people from all the different organizations, young earth creationist organizations, which have different positions on different questions like the flood boundary. Where does the flood start and stop in the geological column? Or what's the answer to the distant light problem? Or how did species form so quickly after the flood, right? These are all big issues within young earth creationism. And here is where some of that gets hashed out. And it can get a little heated. There's a lot of disagreements, and this coming year could be especially heated because of what Answers in Genesis has done, right? Answers in Genesis has written this whole series of articles about the dangers of young earth evolution, calling out a whole bunch of different people who are well-known, sometimes lesser known, but nonetheless important young earth creationists within the young earth creationist community, and basically laid it out that if they're not heretics, they're on the way to heresy. And so how are we going to get them, because I know some of them are going to be at the International Creation Conference. Is Answers in Genesis going to also be there? Are they going to boycott it? How are they going to get along when there's been such strong words spoken about it? And so it's within that context that Randy Guliuzza, the president of ICR, is calling for, is trying to say we need to have a covenant for civility and respect. We need to calm our jets. We need to cool down here. Yes, we disagree. Randy Guliuzza disagrees very much with Answers in Genesis on other topics, like natural selection, whether it even exists, right? That conjures up a lot of strong emotions among young earth creationists. But he's saying we need to calm down here and realize we're really all together in this, and we need to learn how to disagree. So let's take a look at what he says here. All right, so this whole first part is just about the research that they're doing at ICR, and they're going to be bringing that research to Cedarville, where the ICC will be held, and they're going to be giving their talks. All right, so of course they're representing themselves and their contribution to ICC. But then we get down to, all right, let's talk about how that conference should go. Right, we need to think before we get there, because there's been a lot of disputes within young earth creationists over the last few years, but especially recently. ICR staff vigorously advocates for positions that we deem are strongly supported by research and by giving the Bible's words their normal contextual meaning. In addition, we believe that humility and love were key factors that powered the growth of the creation science movement from the beginning. We tried to emulate ICR's early leaders like Henry Morris and Dwayne Gish and so forth. So, all right. We're trying to say that we want to always let a gracious spirit be our distinguishing characteristic. Now, one can argue about whether they've been successful at that or not, but he's saying this is what we would like to be and what we want to be. The ICC can pose a challenge to creationists in how we respond when we hear others present ideas that are different. Remember, he's talking about other creationists, not others outside of creationism, and sometimes radically divergent. All right? Yes, ICR has some radically divergent views from Answers in Genesis and other creationists. They are going to present ideas that other young earth creationists think are completely wrong, right? And they think other creationists are completely wrong. So yes, they are radically divergent. At the ICC, the information and opinions span a wide range. Yes, you're going to see the widest breadth of viewpoints at ICC. Some content is so plainly consistent or inconsistent with biblical truth that it reinforces established positions. Other information is clearly onto something new that creationists might have missed for years. These are good things. When reacting to information that is new we need to disagree with, we must humbly remember that we see through the glass darkly in many areas. But we are still creationists, and foremost, we are still Christians. And then he goes on about how these are the tenets of things that we all agree upon, right? We believe on the core things about what makes us young earth creationists and the foundations, right? So what's the need then for a creation covenant? Humility and love are virtues in short supply in the academic arena, right? The academic arena. And I think he's taking a jab at the overall academic arena, but he's saying that that's true also for young earth creationists in our arena, right? Our discipline. Creation scientists should keenly recognize this deficiency and resolve to be different. We shouldn't be like everybody else, all right? We should be different. This implies that we really haven't done a very good job at being different. In our relationships with other creationists, we need to submit to these biblical admonitions. These things I command you, that you love one another. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another. Put on tender mercies, kindness, meekness, long-suffering. Long-suffering would be pretty helpful. Bearing with one another and forgiving one another. There are also serious warnings about how Christians should not treat one another, such as do not bite and devour, envy and provoke, or be puffed up with pride in one another. Thus, creationists should pledge to reject and desist from singling out fellow creationists and dispensing professional sorrow like haughty, unbelieving scientists do. All right, so again, let's take a shot at the unbelieving scientist and say that we shouldn't display all those same behavioral traits because we've been called to be different in Christ. We should specifically refuse to suppress opposing views with such underhanded tactics as ignoring contrary research or killing it through an abusive peer review process, ruining other scientists' credibility or assassinating their characters by humiliating them in person, blogs, or sham peer-reviewed papers. Wow. He's talking about creation scientists here. I mean, he's suggesting that this is what other secular scientists do in their journals and so forth. But he's not denying that that doesn't happen among young earth creationists. And that is the charge here, that we need to be different this way. Now, I got a pretty good idea of the specific cases that he's talking about here, but I'm not going to go into those in detail here. But this ignoring contrary research, I mean, Randy Guliuzza really feels that, right? Because he has a fairly radical idea, he and now his organization, about how species adapt to their environment. And I'm sure he feels that that's been killed through abusive peer review process, right? There are individuals who have different ideas and they're having trouble publishing those in young earth creationist journals. And then, yes, there's plenty of blogs and sham peer-reviewed papers. In other words, editors of one journal that have friends who, just publish whatever they write, whereas they make it very difficult for those who they don't agree with their views to get it published in those particular articles. All right, so we're also engaging in name-calling, publicly denouncing or anathematizing them, disrespecting them at meetings, or bringing on professional exile by shunning them at conferences. All right, the shunning at conferences, that's happened to ICR. All right, their scientists have had some trouble having joint times at conferences and speaking events. All right, so this is relatively personal for ICR because they're really being affected by this. And we've talked about some of this in the past. But, and I don't blame Randy Guliuzza for saying this all. He's actually right about that. Even if they're at the receiving end, I think he also, and as we're going to see, he's going to admit they've been on the giving end of some of these things too. And he's asking for forgiveness. Oh, let's pick it up here. From the many illustrations in Leslie Flynn's book, Great Church Fights, it's plain that there will always be Christians firmly convinced that engaging in shameful behavior to damage other Christians they disagree with is sanctioned by the Lord Jesus to save his church from embarrassment or theological ruin. I couldn't say that better myself. This is what I see happening in large swaths of the Christian church, especially as it relates to how we associate with certain politicians, that we engage in the behavior that it says that it's all right to damage other Christians that we disagree with because we think it's sanctioned by Jesus because we're fighting for the right side. ICR's pioneers understood how error is addressed is equally important to actually addressing it. I love this statement, right? How error is addressed, right? How the errors themselves are addressed, the method of addressing them, is equally important to actually addressing it. Some people think that whatever method I need to destroy another idea is appropriate because that idea was wrong. Right? The ends justify the means, really, when it comes down to it. Saying, no, the method, how we go about addressing error, both in fellow Christians and outside of Christianity, goes a long way toward our witness. And so how we do that is very important. So he goes on to say, I admire how these founders, the ICR founders, didn't come across as proud, ill-tempered, or dismissive way when they identified errors in the work of other creation scientists and evolutionists. Now, I'd have to go back and really look at how they've discussed things in the past to say whether I completely agree with that statement or not, but the sentiment is important. That it's important for us to have leaders that are approaching questions and disagreement in the right way. Okay, now here comes the money paragraph, right? The one I started out. At ICR, we want to start with a clean slate. A clean slate? Yes, we've done wrong in the past. We want to attempt to wipe some of that away and say we need to reaffirm our convictions. We've gotten away from our convictions. How so? We regret and ask for forgiveness for our 2020 issue of Acts and Facts, in which we are condemnatory of our criticism of several fellow creation scientists, misrepresented some of their positions, and called them some names. The author also apologized for his words in the letters to the editor section of the Creation Research Society Quarterly. We are truly sorry for the hurt we inflicted and are grieved that others have subsequently picked up on the name calling in our article to aid in the new denunciations. All right, we'll come back to that last part of the sentence in a moment, but let's go back to the beginning here. What are they asking for forgiveness for this Acts and Facts article? What was that Acts and Facts article about? Oh, well, let's go take a look. Here we go. This is by Jake Hebert. I think I've been calling him Herbert at times, but I think it's Hebert. From Friday, July 31st, 2020. I'm certain that this is the article referenced, even though they don't have a reference in his other article. Is creation evidence ambiguous? Is the evidence for creation ambiguous? Could an honest seeker of the truth reasonably conclude there is no God? Is the evolutionary old Earth story a reasonable inference from the scientific data? Well, answer to that, ICR is going to say, of course not. The Institute for Creation Research would forcefully argue that the answer to this question is no. But surprisingly, some young Earth creationists claim otherwise. They have been called young Earth evolutionists, or YEEs. What, does that sound familiar? Remember Answers in Genesis? Answers in Genesis has this entire series of 11 articles now calling out young Earth evolution and young Earth evolutionist, calling out young Earth creationists within the midst of young Earth creationism and calling them young Earth evolutionists, right? This group is heavily influenced by the philosophy called fideism. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole fideism thing. But if you've heard me in any other talks talking about young Earth evolution by Answers in Genesis, and if you've read any of those articles, you know what I'm talking about, because one of those articles is about fideism. The person who wrote the articles for Answers in Genesis was heavily influenced by this article, right? Lots of wording, little pieces of this article end up being entire articles for Answers in Genesis. So this is one of the, I'll say, inspirations for Answers in Genesis viewpoints and about young Earth evolution. YEEs credulously accept absurd evolutionary claims at face value. One YE suggests that there was walking whales on Noah's Ark. Right, that's Kurt Wise. And there's a whole article at Answers in Genesis about Kurt Wise. YEs uncritically accept the claim of evolutionists that many fossils are good candidates for missing links. Guess what Answers in Genesis has? A whole article on missing links, really focused on bird feathers, all right? And a criticism of that. They claim that the Earth is young but looks old. Guess what Answers in Genesis has? An article about Ken Coulson and his sort of views of the Earth's rate of change and how it looks old. ICR has addressed this fallacious claim elsewhere. Not too surprisingly, evolutionist and bitter opponent of biblical Christianity, Richard Dawkins, has given one YE qualified praise for being an honest creationist. He's talking about Todd Wood there, right? One notices a pattern. Young Earth evolutionists tend to play up supposed evidence for evolution while playing down the evidence for creation. Is this because the evidence is truly equivocal and we creationists have been overstating our position? Or is it because YEs are philosophically opposed to even the possibility that the evidence could strongly favor creationism? All right, these are really strong words against other creationists. What's really at stake? Here at ICR, we see evidence for young Earth evolutionism is bearing some very bad fruit. A reliable first-hand witness told me that a graduate student at a conservative creationist university is in danger of falling away from the faith after prolonged exposure to YEE teachings of that school's faculty members. Is anyone really surprised by this? That whole series by Answers in Genesis, effectively one of the foundational ideas that kind of permeates through all 11 of those articles, is this idea that we're driving people away, that they're pulling people away from young earth creationists by corrupting their minds. Biblical creationists cannot afford to get this wrong. Affirming a recent creation and a global flood is meaningless if one claims that evidence for these things is ambiguous or equivocal. Biblical creation is true, and the scientific and historical evidence strongly confirms this. See, these individuals, in their minds, aren't being strong enough supporters of young earth creation and by questioning some of the other claims of young earth creationists. Okay, so that's the article that's being referenced here, right? From 2020. So let's go back. So that's the issue 2020 of Acts and Facts, in which we were condemning in our criticisms of several fellow creation scientists. These are all the same creation scientists that Answers in Genesis is criticizing right now. Very, very strongly criticizing in the last couple of months. Misrepresented some of their positions. They're admitting here, Randy Guliuzza is admitting here, we didn't really represent their positions right. Right? We overstated their positions, or we're just wrong about them. Answers in Genesis is not fixing that problem. Right? They're accentuating that problem by continuing to misrepresent them. And by the way, Answers in Genesis, you can't go and blame this particular article. You have all the original sources. And so it's not simply that you were misled by ICR in this particular article. That was a very short article, and you've gone to great lengths to write much more beyond what ICR has done, and called some of them names. Answers in Genesis has done nothing less, all right, with respect to name calling than ICR has done. And what are we doing here? ICR is saying we need to start with a clean slate. We regret and ask for forgiveness for these particular actions. Right? They've even done this in writing before in the Creation Research Society Quarterly. And we're truly sorry for the hurt we inflicted and are grieved that others have subsequently picked up on the name calling in our article to aid in new denunciations. That's talking about Answers in Genesis, right? They picked up stuff in this article and are abusing that by accentuating and expanding upon it in their articles at AiG. All right? They're sorry for the hurt they've caused to those individuals who are now being hurt worse. And really what they're doing is they're seeing the fruits of their labor from 2020, all right, come to fruition now through Answers in Genesis. And properly recognizing this was an inappropriate action. This was not the way to interact with other Christians. These are people that we're going to go see at the ICC conference, right? They're going to be there, and we need to have fellowship with them. And we need to try to understand why they earnestly are saying what they're saying, because they express all the same foundational theological concepts and have the same motives in terms of preserving what they believe is the truth of the understanding of scriptures in Genesis. And so they're recognizing that although we may disagree with them and we think that their hypothesis is wrong, we also need to be Christians who can listen to other hypotheses and use data and evidence to try to argue that they're wrong, rather than name calling and simply trying to remove them from the community, therefore protecting the community. This is very appropriate anti-cult behavior, all right? You're saying we become cultish, right, when we exclude members from our midst that are fundamentally like us. We simply don't agree with every one of their positions. We will endeavor not to engage in these behaviors in the future. Now, they're sinners, like all the rest of us, like all these other organizations, and it could well be that one of them will lose their temper, they'll say something, they'll write something that doesn't quite measure up to their lofty goal here, which is an appropriate goal. It's a Christian Christ-like goal. And I'll be disappointed and others will be disappointed if they do that or when they do that. But it's a good thing that they're pronouncing and asking for forgiveness for this particular behavior. As I said, creationists are passionate people by nature. We have a zeal for biblical and scientific truth that is diametrically opposed to the world's thinking. As creationists, let's covenant together to reject the world's methods in how we express disagreement. Right? We can express disagreement, but we need to do it in a Christian way, in a Christ-like way, not as the world does it, as the rest of the world that doesn't know Christ does it. He knows that when he goes to ICC, he's going to be met with a lot of criticism. And you could say, if you were really cynical, and I hope I'm not cynical here, but I could see that a cynic might say this is self-serving, right? He knows that some of his ideas are not getting the play that he would like them to, and that ICR scientists aren't getting the respect that they really deserve for doing what he thinks is really good science and cutting edge stuff. And he is challenging the status quo because honestly, AiG is the status quo. They are the standard, right? What they say is probably what the average young earth creationist follower probably thinks is what young earth creationists believe. And therefore, the things that ICR have been promoting lately run contrary to that. And so they're the people that are on the outs trying to make inroads, right? And change the viewpoint of young earth creationism. And that's a tough road to go. And he needs to have effective communication and the ability to have an opportunity to express his views. He's not wrong, though. He's not at all wrong. He should not be excluded from these things. If creation scientists and creation science and young earth creationists wants to consider themselves a self-correcting, data-driven science that wants to compete with the secular worldview of the Earth's origins, then they have to work through these issues, and they have to challenge each other to make their ideas better if they want to have any chance of challenging views outside of young earth creationism. So I applaud Randy Guliuzza and what he's done here. I think he's appropriately called out Answers in Genesis for the way in which they have responded to young earth evolutionists. He's not necessarily saying that all the things that Answers in Genesis say are wrong, that like maybe they do have what he views as an incorrect view of feathered dinosaurs, for example. But he's saying how Answers in Genesis has gone about calling out young earth evolutionists, and clearly Answers in Genesis is trying to poison the well for those individuals that are the young earth evolutionists, trying to make it difficult for them to find jobs at other young earth creationist organizations, trying to make it difficult for them to publish in other journals because the editors won't want to publish their works because Ken Ham has criticized them and suggested that they're not truly real young earth creationists, right? That kind of approach to rejecting your enemies and to paving the path to your particular viewpoint is more cult-like than it is Christ-like. And so I applaud Randy Guliuzza for calling out the cult and saying, let's remember Christ in how we interact with fellow Christians. We're on the same side, right? Even if we don't feel like we all have exactly the exact details right. And so we shouldn't be punishing each other for that, right? And so I think this comes from a good place. And I think this is a really positive development in the sense that it's really taking on Answers in Genesis for what the real problem with that series is. This is sort of like my gut feeling when I read the series is like this at its root level is addressing the problem with that thing, right? I can pick out all kinds of scientific problems with Answers in Genesis articles, right? It has extremely naive views of some scientific principles, right? And I think it does misunderstand some of the young Earth evolutionist views. All right, so there's lots of problems with those articles. And I think the tone against individuals is not that great. And so, but underlining all that is just the overall approach to how we talk about other Christians and how we call them back and call them out. All right, I'm just rambling now, and I'm just scrolling up and down. So let's go down here to the bottom. Right, creationists are very passionate people by nature. We have a zeal for biblical and scientific truth that is diametrically opposed to the world's thinking. As creationists, let's covenant together and reject the world's methods in how we express disagreement. There it is. There's the summary right there. We're going to disagree, right? But how we disagree is a witness to the rest of the world. We need to disagree in a different way than others might. We need to show love. There can be correction and love, but there has to be love behind our correction, not simply personal feelings and pride. We need to be humble. So this was a great article. I was really happy to see it. I don't think I was surprised to see it, actually. I kind of thought this might be the response from ICR. I've been getting kind of that feeling that they kind of, like I said before, they kind of understand how the young Earth evolutionists feel, because I think they're starting to feel that kind of like we're being pushed to the fringes and we're not being allowed to participate in the process of discovery and, developing creation science further. All right, let's quit there. I don't have, I've got lots more things to say, but it's going to be a lot of the same stuff. All right, let's quit there. Randy Guliuzza, job well done with this article. I think that this is going to make Answers in Genesis, I was going to say it's going to make them reflect and think, and maybe they'll have a change of heart, but nah. Barring the work of the Holy Spirit at Answers in Genesis, I don't see them being able to be humble enough to admit that their series on young Earth evolutionists took the wrong approach. But I'd be happy to be wrong. Absolutely happy to be wrong. All right, let's call it quits there. Thanks for hanging out with me. Hit subscribe, like, all that good stuff. And we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.